You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Have you ever wondered why we call French fries, or why something is the greatest thing since sliced bread? There are answers to those questions. Everything Everywhere Daily is a podcast for curious people who want to learn more about the world around them. Every day, you'll learn something new about things you never knew you didn't know. Subjects include history, science, geography, mathematics, and culture. If you're a curious person and want to learn more about the world you live in, just subscribe to Everything Everywhere Daily wherever you cast your pod.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 502 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, thanks for tuning into the podcast. With the last episode, we finished up the Overland campaign, so with this show, as promised, we're starting a new major story arc as we leave Virginia and head down to Georgia for the Atlanta campaign.
We're very excited to be starting this story arc. The struggle for Atlanta was one of the most significant campaigns of the Civil War. It's not going too far out on a limb to say it was one of the pivotal events of the Civil War. It not only led to the Federals' capture of the city, but Sherman's success also helped decide the outcome of the 1864 presidential contest, with Lincoln's re-election that November.
From our coverage of the Overland campaign, y'all know that, like the several federal expeditions in Virginia that spring, the fighting through the North Georgia mountains in mid-1864 was also the result of a strategy initiated by Ulysses S. Grant soon after his promotion to General-in-Chief of the Union armies.
Exactly, and Grant's plan was simple. With the commencement of the spring campaigns, the Federal armies would advance simultaneously to prevent the Confederates from shifting reinforcements between theaters, as had happened the previous year when James Longstreet and his rebel troops had been sent south from Virginia to aid Braxton Bragg, arriving just in time to take part in the Battle of Chickamauga.
And so, as part of Grant's grand strategy from May to September 1864, William Tecumseh Sherman maneuvered the Federal force under his command down through North Georgia, applying continuous pressure on the Confederate Army defending Atlanta.
The campaign took the armies from the Tennessee border to the outskirts of Atlanta. The maneuvering and fighting tested the endurance of the soldiers and the skill of their commanders, Sherman on the Federal side and Confederate General Joe Johnston. Then, when Confederate President Jefferson Davis ran out of patience with Johnston's strategy, Davis replaced him with the more aggressive John B. Hood. The decisions Sherman, Johnston, and Hood made, as well as those of the two presidents, Lincoln and Davis, shaped the events that led to the fall of Atlanta in September.
The Federals' capture of Atlanta had far-reaching consequences, militarily, politically, and socially. This was the first time the Yankees had occupied soil in the interior of Georgia, and the first time large numbers of its people had been displaced by the war.
And, as we said already, the fall of Atlanta happened on the eve of a critical presidential election, when Abraham Lincoln, with Grant stalled in Eastern Virginia, Lincoln badly needed a victory somewhere to help convince the Northern public that he deserved to retain control of the White House.
And so, with this story arc, we'll work our way through the Atlanta campaign, illustrating the enormous importance of the Western theater to the outcome of the war, and showing the dire consequences of the loss of Atlanta for the Confederate cause.
William Tecumseh Sherman left Chattanooga and rode into North Georgia on May 5, 1864, the same day that Ulysses S. Grant, having crossed the Rapidan with the Army of the Potomac, launched what would become the Overland Campaign in Virginia. 2 days later, Sherman kicked off the campaign that would take him to the outskirts of Atlanta. And so the principal federal field armies in the East and West were pulling together at last. On battlefields nearly 600 miles apart, Grant's grand strategy would now be put to the test.
But to get us to the first week in May in North Georgia, we're going to need to do some backtracking so that we can set the stage for the beginning of the Atlanta campaign. And this really shouldn't come as a surprise to you, since if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you know we're big on setting the stage.
Right. Well, to begin setting the stage for the Atlanta campaign, we're going to go back to the start of the year. Not this year, but 1864. And on the bitterly cold first day of 1864 in Washington, D.C., Abraham Lincoln was hosting the customary New Year's Day reception at the White House. And as he shook hands with the visitors filing by, Lincoln would have seemed to have good reason to feel pleased about the progress of the war, since the Union had enjoyed considerable success on the conflict's battlefields in 1863.
At Gettysburg, the long-suffering Army of the Potomac had finally won a clear-cut victory over the Army of Northern Virginia, proving that Robert E. Lee wasn't invincible after all. And out west on the Mississippi River, over 30,000 rebel troops had been captured when Grant forced the surrender of Vicksburg, which, along with the fall of Port Hudson, ensured that the Father of Waters once again flowed unvexed to the sea.
Then, as November was drawing to a close, Grant scored another victory at Missionary Ridge outside Chattanooga in southeast Tennessee, when the main federal army in the West was routed and driven into northwest Georgia. And as the calendar turned over from 1863 to 1864, most of Tennessee, Arkansas, and Louisiana, plus large portions of Virginia, Alabama, and Mississippi, had been conquered by the federal armies, and everywhere the vastly outnumbered rebels stood on the defensive.
However, the price of the federal success had been high. Of the nearly 2 million men so far mustered into the Union armies, at least 250,000 were dead, about 1/3 from battle, and most of the rest from sickness. In addition, tens of thousands of federal soldiers were languishing in crowded POW camps, where hunger and disease killed them at an alarming rate.
As the calendar rolled over from 1863 to 1864, the conflict was entering its third year, and many people in the North who had initially supported the war were horrified by the cost in blood thus far. They and others were appalled at the length of the casualty lists and shocked by the sight of veterans who returned home missing an eye, an arm, or a leg, or with their bodies wasted by sickness.
The financial cost of the war, like the human toll, had soared far beyond what anyone in the North had anticipated in the long-ago days of 1861. Tens of thousands all across the North were deeply alarmed by the many changes the prolonged conflict was forcing onto their society.
They resented the higher taxes that took an increasing part of their income, the draft that forced thousands of unwilling young men into military service, and the infringements on civil liberties that marked the Lincoln administration's clumsy efforts to deal with its domestic critics. In addition, hundreds of thousands who had supported the war in 1861 and 62 lamented the fact that what had begun as a crusade to preserve the Union had also become a war against slavery.
All of that's to say that at the start of 1864, there were numerous reasons to explain the growing war weariness in the North, as large segments of the population were, at most, lukewarm in their support for the way the war was being prosecuted.
Northern Democrats saw this growing war weariness as the key to ending Republican control of Congress and the White House. The vast majority of Northern Democrats desired to preserve the Union, but they also believed it was the anti-slavery fanaticism of the Republicans that had provoked the South into secession, thereby bringing on the war.
Likewise, most Northern Democrats supported the war effort, but disliked the way it was being conducted. They feared that the draft, the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus in the border states, and the arrest by military authorities of those deemed disloyal represented attempts by the Republicans to use the war to destroy civil liberties and permanently entrench themselves in power.
They also believed that Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was an unconstitutional act that fostered race equality and stiffened Southern resistance, thereby prolonging the war. For all these reasons, the Northern Democrats had become more interested in ending the war than in winning it. Well, at least winning it on Republican terms. And so the Democrats' basic view, proclaimed repeatedly by their leaders and newspapers, was that the military effort to put down the rebellion was a failure, and in spite of the victories of 1863, would continue to fail. And so the best, indeed only way to reunite the nation was to offer the Confederates peace on the basis of the Union as it was and the Constitution as it is. That is, the South would be allowed to come back into the Union as if it had never left, and slavery would remain in existence as if Lincoln had never issued his Emancipation Proclamation, and as if thousands of blacks had never enlisted in the Union Army to fight for freedom.
The Republicans responded by calling the Democrats traitors and labeling them copperheads. But except for a few who are driven literally crazy by hatred of Republicans and abolitionism, the Democrats weren't traitors.
Instead, they were a party composed of politicians who were bitter over the loss of long accustomed power to the upstart Republicans and who craved to get it back. Of whites who were disgusted and frightened by the very idea of free blacks and race equality. Of conservatives who were alarmed by the revolutionary changes brought by the war and were afraid there would be more. And of people who were simply found it intolerable that fellow Americans should be slaughtering one another in battle for, as they saw it, no valid reason.
But the Democrats were unable to see two great fundamental facts. First, it would be impossible to turn back the clock and pretend Lincoln had never issued the Emancipation Proclamation.
And the second is that the majority of white Southerners had no desire to return to the Union under any terms, but were determined to continue fighting and secure what they had sacrificed and bled for 3 years to secure, that is, the independence of their Southern slaveholding republic.
Most Northerners realized this. They also supported emancipation for practical as well as moral reasons. That is, they saw it as a means of both putting down the rebellion and punishing the rebels.
And after the great military victories of 1863, they rejected and resented the claim that the effort to restore the Union was hopeless. Consequently, the Democrats' denunciation of the war, their opposition to emancipation, and their agitation for peace cost them heavily. At the beginning of 1864, they held only 2 governorships, New York and New Jersey, and during the recent fall elections, they failed to carry a single state.
In addition, thousands of lifelong Democrats, especially those serving in the Army, no longer supported the party. Either they voted for Republican candidates or joined the Republican Party, which around this time changed its official name to the Union Party to attract these quote-unquote war Democrats.
Nevertheless, the Democrats remained formidable. They controlled most of the big cities, where large populations of German and Irish immigrants resented the perceived anti-foreign and anti-Catholic prejudice that characterized the mainly native-born Protestant Republicans.
Democrats were powerful, almost predominant in the border states and in the lower Midwest and in New York and New Jersey. In fact, nowhere except for a few states in New England and on the plains were the Democrats hopelessly outmatched by the Republicans, whose majorities in some places were razor thin.
Above all, the Democrats claimed that the war was a failure and that only peace could restore the Union, although a losing card up until that point was potentially an election-winning message. This had been demonstrated in 1862, when Confederate battlefield successes had caused disappointment and discouragement to grip many Northerners, and in the fall elections that year, the Democrats, who blamed Lincoln for the military setbacks, scored spectacular gains. Overall, they halved the Republican majority in the House of Representatives and took away the governorship of New York.
In effect, with the fall 1862 elections, the North expressed its unhappiness with Lincoln's leadership, and had he been running for re-election at that time, there's a good chance he would have been defeated.
During the remainder of 1862 and the first half of 1863, the war continued to go badly for the North, with a feudal bloodbath at Fredericksburg, a humiliation at nearby Chancellorsville, and a stalemate out in Tennessee and along the Mississippi. Had not Lee been turned back at Gettysburg, and had not Grant captured Vicksburg, and had not Rosecrans broken the stalemate in Tennessee, the Democrats that fall almost surely would have won control of Ohio and other key states, making it practically impossible for the Lincoln administration to continue prosecuting the war.
However, those victories revived Northern morale and stabilized Republican political fortunes, enabling them to carry every state that held elections in the fall of 1863, except New Jersey.
But the lesson of 1862 and 63 was clear. The course of the war determined the course of politics. The meaning of that lesson for 1864 was therefore obvious. Should the Federal armies move forward decisively on the path toward victory, Lincoln and the Republicans would remain in power. But if those armies should bog down, or seem to do so, and if the casualty list lengthened without any sign of ever ending, then there was a very good chance the majority of Northerners would give up on the war and turn to the Democrats with their false yet seductive promise that peace would bring the restoration of the Union.
As the calendar turned over from 1863 to 1864, the Democrats, as well as Lincoln and the Republicans, understood that somewhere there was a point beyond which popular support for the war would not go.
Success, or at least the perception of success, by the Federal armies would push that point farther out in time, while failure, or perceived failure, would bring it closer. And so, looking ahead to the 1864 presidential election, Abraham Lincoln was like a man 3/4 of the way up a rickety ladder. A massive battlefield defeat, or terribly costly casualty lists, could undermine popular support for the war and destabilize the ground at the foot of the ladder. Even though he'd climbed high prosecuting the war, a misstep could still send Lincoln tumbling to the ground. Therefore, he and the Republicans had ample reason to worry as the main Federal armies prepared to kick off the spring 1864 campaigns in Virginia and Georgia.
This episode of the podcast is sponsored by the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War.
Are you looking for a deeper connection to history and want to make an impact in your community? Well, the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War is a charitable, fraternal organization dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the heroes who fought to save the Union and end slavery.
With values of fraternity, charity, and loyalty, from powerful bonds of brotherhood to rich traditions and rituals, the SUVCW offers its members the opportunity to participate in meaningful relationships and advance important causes, and are encouraged to be involved in community leadership.
The Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War accepts both descendants of veterans and non-descendants. To learn more, visit suvcw.org, or you can email join@suvcw.org.
The views, information, or opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Between two-factor authentication, strong passwords, and a VPN, you try to be in control of how your info is protected. But many other places also have it, and they might not be as careful. That's why LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast for 40% off. Terms apply.
With the 1864 presidential election looming on the horizon, Lincoln and the Republicans and the Democrats were going to be keeping a close eye that spring and summer on the progress, or lack thereof, of the campaigns being waged by the federal armies in Virginia and Georgia.
Really, though, there shouldn't have been any drama at all, since the Federals had always possessed the men and material to win the war. The Yankees' great problem had been finding a general, particularly in the Eastern Theater, who had the will to apply those resources ruthlessly, the competence to do so effectively, the willingness to work with the president in a way that furthered the overall policies of the administration, and the ability to get the job done before public support for the war reached its limit.
Abraham Lincoln certainly had the will and the determination to use whatever force was necessary to achieve victory. However, during the war's first 3 years, Lincoln had been unable to find a general in the East with comparable determination. But in Ulysses S. Grant, the president hoped that he'd finally found the man who could bring the war to a victorious conclusion.
Grant had proved he has the knack for war. He was aggressive, as he showed at Belmont, Fort Henry, and Fort Donelson.
He remains cool and clear-headed in times of crisis, as at Shiloh, where the enemy surprised and nearly defeated him.
He's determined, as he demonstrated during the long months when he tried to find a way to get at Vicksburg, failing again and again until he finally succeeded.
He's bold and clever, as proved when he outsmarted the Confederates defending Vicksburg in what was the war's most brilliant campaign of maneuver.
And Napoleon would have been pleased, for, last but not least, Ulysses S. Grant was lucky, as was made clear at Missionary Ridge, where the Federal troops, against Grant's intent and without his orders, nevertheless drove the rebels from a position that should have been impregnable.
After the victory at Missionary Ridge at the end of November 1863, Grant would have liked to begin a major move into Georgia immediately, or at any rate sometime during the winter, so the Confederates wouldn't have a chance to catch their breath, rally, and rebuild. But such a movement simply wasn't practical.
The weather was atrocious. The roads were either ice-covered or muddy, and the troops were weary after the 1863 campaigns, and they needed time to rest. In addition, before any large-scale offensive could be undertaken, something had to be done about the supply situation.
Because even though Grant had opened the Cracker Line so that supplies could once more begin to flow, the soldiers of the Army of the Cumberland at Chattanooga and of the Army of the Ohio at Knoxville were still on half rations.
And so, because of the still shaky supply situation, The Federals in eastern Tennessee would have had trouble advancing even if no enemy opposed them. This, even though up at Louisville in Kentucky, at Nashville in north-central Tennessee, and at Memphis over on the Mississippi River, the quartermaster warehouses bulged with all kinds of supplies. The Federals' problem was in transporting those supplies where they were needed.
To work on this problem, in December 1863, the War Department sent Colonel Daniel McCallum to Tennessee to reopen the Memphis and Charleston Railroad to Chattanooga, and in mid-January, McCallum's workers hammered the last spikes into place. A few hours later, the troops of the Army of the Cumberland cheered the arrival of the first cracker train from Nashville.
Well, that was all well and good, but if the Federal forces in Tennessee were going to carry out a major offensive, they needed more than just enough to eat on a day-to-day basis. They would have to accumulate huge stockpiles of supplies. And given the state of the operations of the various rail lines in Tennessee, that was impossible.
For example, there were only 39 locomotives and 400 freight cars in service on the 292 miles of track that connected Nashville to Chattanooga, Knoxville, and other points in Tennessee and Alabama, where Federal forces were posted. In comparison, 40 locomotives and 800 cars were assigned to the 70 miles of railroad supplying the Army of the Potomac in Virginia.
McCallum reported the need for more locomotives and freight cars to George Thomas, the commander of the Army of the Cumberland, and Thomas told Grant. Grant then placed McCallum in control of all railroads in the military division of the Mississippi, and McCallum set himself the goal of putting 200 locomotives and 3,000 cars into operation in Tennessee.
Besides the Federals' logistical challenges, another obstacle to a major movement into Georgia from Chattanooga was Confederate Lieutenant General James Longstreet. As y'all will recall, back in September 1863, the Confederate War Department had sent Old Pete, along with 2 infantry divisions, from Virginia to help Braxton Bragg, and they had helped Bragg win the Battle of Chickamauga.
Subsequently, Longstreet, with 20,000 troops, had moved north against Knoxville. Late in November, Longstreet attacked the Yankees' defenses at Knoxville and suffered a stinging defeat. That defeat and the approach of a Federal relief column had caused Longstreet to back off toward the Virginia border. And by January, Longstreet was no longer a serious threat, but Grant didn't know that.
Grant lacked reliable intelligence, so he still thought Longstreet might again attack Knoxville, or that Old Pete might even strike west and threaten Nashville. And so early in January, Grant directed the commander of the Army of the Ohio, Major General John Foster, to push Longstreet completely out of Tennessee.
Foster, with about 20,000 troops, made a half-hearted advance eastward from Knoxville, but then turned back, citing numerous excuses about why he couldn't continue moving against Longstreet in the middle of the winter. Grant, however, was not in the mood for Foster's excuses and replaced him with Major General John Schofield. Meanwhile, Grant remained troubled that Longstreet was still in eastern Tennessee, posing a potential threat to Grant's left flank.
Grant also wanted to secure his right flank before advancing into North Georgia. That flank rested out on the Mississippi River, where Federal forces held Memphis, Vicksburg, and other key points.
However, Confederate forces still more or less controlled the interior of the state of Mississippi. So should Grant transfer most of the Union troops from there in order to help with an advance into Georgia, then the rebels could cause trouble by harassing northern shipping on the Mississippi River, or, far worse, striking up into western Tennessee and attacking the vital railroad supply lines out of Nashville.
To address these dangers, Grant authorized an expedition that would advance eastward from Vicksburg, right across Mississippi to Meridian, near the Alabama border. Its purpose was to damage Mississippi's rail system so badly that the Confederates wouldn't be able to assemble a large force in the state.
And commanding that operation would be the Union general who conceived it, William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman was a general who would come to believe that the war must be waged against the South's people as well as its armies. And so on January 31st, 3 days before setting out from Vicksburg, he instructed his adjutant to prepare a message warning all those living in the interior of Mississippi that the region was about to be invaded. He did this, he said, so the message would, quote, prepare them for my coming. All right, and that's where we'll wrap things up for this show, having started to set the stage for the Atlanta campaign by looking at what was happening on the federal side at the start of 1864. With the next episode, we'll turn our attention to the Confederates and see what was going on with them.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Echoes of Glory, the Illustrated Atlas of the Civil War by the editors of Time Life Books.
If you've been around for a while, you probably realize that at some point near the beginning of each major story arc, we like to re-recommend this title, which is still our go-to Civil War atlas when we pull one off of the shelf. It's long out of print, but it's still readily available in all the usual places you find used books for sale.
As always, you can find a complete list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info about joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Ryan R., Andrew S., Peter B., Matt H., and Madlop26 did this past week.
A big thank you to each of them, and thanks also to all of you for listening to this episode. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.